Romans 5, verse 16 and 18, and Romans 8, verse 1. And the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one transgression, resulting in condemnation. But on the other hand, the free gift arose from many transgressions, resulting in justification. So then, as through one transgression there resulted condemnation to all men, even so, through one act of righteousness, there resulted justification of life to all men. And therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The God word that we're considering today is the word condemnation. Like many of the other God words that we've looked at, this is a legal term. The term justification, the term righteousness, are words that come from the court of law. Justification is being declared not guilty of whatever crime one is accused of. Righteousness is similar and sometimes interchanged, but righteousness is the result that happens as one is declared not guilty. The reality that we need to face in our spiritual lives as we hear God's invitation to fellowship with Himself, as we have seen already, is that the result of sin is that we fall short of the glory of God. Because we sin, we are not worthy to be in God's presence. We've also used the word death to describe what happened when sin came into our world. It brought physical death, but more importantly, it brought spiritual death and separation from God. And the word condemnation is another word to emphasize for us what it means that we sin and what its consequences are. This word that comes from the court of law is the pronouncement of a judgment against the guilty. After the jury has heard all the evidence, and the jury finds that the evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, is conclusive, the jury will announce to the court that they find the defendant guilty. And then the judge will, based on the law and the crime committed, pronounce a judgment against the guilty party. That's what this word condemnation is. That one is condemned to carry out the sentence against him or her. In a spiritual sense, we understand that this sentence has eternal consequences. I've thought that maybe a lot of what is happening in the world around us doesn't really matter, that what really matters is that which lasts for eternity. And that all the temporal things, all the things of the world, all the things of this life are intended only to make us yearn for the eternal. That the brokenness, that the sorrow, that the dysfunction, not to say that there aren't good things in life, there certainly are. Many good things in life, and yet death around us and dysfunction around us and all these things ought not cause us despair, but they do cause despair if all we have is condemnation that is a result of our sin. if all we have is a judgment that has been spoken against us that does have eternal consequences. That means that we will be separated from God for all eternity, because the core of sin is that we don't trust that God has promised us good things, that God has promised forgiveness of sins and has called us into fellowship with himself. I suppose at the very core of that is even a refusal to believe that God exists. And the consequences for that are eternal separation from that God. What a blessing it is then to recognize that there is an antidote to condemnation. Now, the judgment against us stands. We're guilty. We sin. We break God's commands. We fail to trust God's promises. We put ourselves in the place of God. All these things that are against God's will, and we call sin, we have to plead guilty in God's court of law. And the judgment stands. He doesn't take the judgment away. Instead, God came to us in Jesus, and Jesus took upon himself our judgment. Jesus took upon himself our condemnation. He exchanged that when he became our sin and died, and as it were, went to hell for us. He exchanged that with his righteousness. He took our condemnation and gave us his righteousness. The declaration of innocence, not because we are innocent, but because he declares us so when we receive, each of us individually, this gift that he gives of taking our condemnation. So we have the beautiful promise in all three of these verses, but maybe most powerfully in Romans 8:1. Therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. When God welcomes us into fellowship, when God calls us into fellowship, he gives us all that is necessary for that to happen. He even gives us the faith by which we accept and believe and trust that his promise is true, that his promise is for us. Like falling short of the glory of God, like death, condemnation is not a fun word, and yet it's a word that we need to wrestle with and understand. We need to be honest about the consequences of our sin. And then we can rejoice and trust, find hope in the gift that God gives to us, in the forgiveness of sin, in Jesus taking our punishment so that he forgives our sin and calls us into fellowship with him. And it's a fellowship that begins now, but it's a fellowship that is for eternity. God bless you.